Will reading was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Saturday in March, and I almost didn't go. My grandmother had died 11 days earlier, quietly in the hospice room that smelled like eucalyptus and old paperbacks, and I had been the one sitting with her when it happened. My brother hadn't come. He'd sent flowers with a card that said "thinking of you both," and I had put the card face down on the windowsill and not said anything about it to anyone. My name is Serena. I was 31 years old that spring, and I had spent the better part of a decade being the one who showed up. I showed up when my grandmother's hip gave out 2 years before, and someone needed to coordinate her transition from the house she'd lived in for 40 years to an assisted living facility 40 minutes from mine. I showed up for the appointments, the forms, the conversations with the facility director about dietary restrictions and room preferences and what kind of music she liked to have playing in the background. I showed up for the Sunday visits and the Tuesday phone calls and the occasional Wednesday when she just sounded a little low, and I drove over anyway. My brother showed up for Christmas and for the occasional birthday, usually late, always carrying the particular energy of someone doing a favor rather than keeping a promise. None of that made me a saint. I want to be honest about that. I showed up partly because I loved her, and partly because I was the kind of person who cannot look at something that needs doing and walk in the other direction. That is not entirely a virtue. The attorney's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, the kind with a lobby that echoes and a reception desk staffed by someone who offers you water in a tone that does not actually invite you to say yes. My brother was already there when I arrived. He was wearing a jacket I hadn't seen before, navy blue, well-fitted, the kind of purchase you make when you want to look like a version of yourself that has its life together. His wife was with him. She had the particular posture of someone who has been told good news and is trying not to let it show on her face. I sat across from them and accepted the water I didn't want and waited. The attorney, a measured man named Mr. Monty Colebrook, who had clearly delivered a great many difficult documents in his career and had developed a manner that was neither warm nor cold but simply precise, opened the folder on his desk and began. My grandmother's estate was modest by certain standards and significant by the ones that actually mattered. The house, a brokerage account she had built slowly over 40 years of careful, unflashy decisions, a small piece of land outside the city that she had inherited from her own mother and never developed and never sold. Mr. Colebrook read the document in the order it was written. The personal belongings were distributed as she had specified, her jewelry to me, a pocket watch to my brother, specific books to specific people, a donation to the library where she had volunteered for 11 years, and then the financial assets. The brokerage account, approximately $340,000 to my brother. The land, appraised at roughly $180,000 to my brother. The house, after it was sold, proceeds to my brother with a specific provision that he use a portion to address outstanding debts in a manner she described as restoring the family's footing. To me, she left a handwritten letter and a cedar box that had sat on her dresser for as long as I could remember. I sat with that for a moment. The room did not change. The light through the window was the same. Mr. Pirron Colebrook's expression was the same, that careful professional neutrality that makes no promises about what comes next. My brother did not look at me. His wife looked at her hands. I picked up the cedar box and the envelope, and I thanked Mr. Colebrook for his time, and I left. I sat in my car for 22 minutes. I know the exact number because I watched the clock on the dashboard move while I tried to understand what I was feeling and whether it was grief or something else. It was not quite either. It was the particular sensation of finally seeing clearly something you had been looking at for a long time without actually focusing. My brother had debts. I knew this the way you know things in families, not directly, not stated, but accumulated through overheard phone calls and a comment from our mother 3 years ago about him being in a difficult stretch, and the way his wife had a habit of referencing financial stress in ways that were meant to sound casual and didn't. I knew the rough shape of it. I didn't know my grandmother had known too, or that she had decided her solution to it was to hand him everything she had spent a lifetime building. I opened the letter in the parking garage. It was 3 pages in her handwriting, careful and sloped. And it was full of love. Genuine love. That part I don't question. She told me I was the person in the family she trusted most to be all right. that she knew I would land on my feet, that she had watched me build a life with her own eyes and she was proud. She said my brother needed the foundation more than I did. She said she hoped I would understand. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and drove home. The cedar box had a small brass clasp. Inside was a photograph of the two of us taken when I was about 7, standing in her garden, both of us squinting into the sun. There was also a folded piece of paper with an account number and a note that said, "For you, kept separately, with love." The account held $14,000. It was a savings account she had opened in my name years ago and never mentioned. I sat with that too, the tenderness of it and the smallness of it and the way both things were true at once. I called my closest friend, a woman named Bex who had known me since graduate school and who had a gift for listening that I don't fully understand because I know it doesn't come naturally to her. She has simply decided I am worth the effort. I told her what had happened. She asked me exactly one question. She said, "Do you think the will was written the way it was written because of something that happened recently?" I didn't know the answer. Not yet. 2 days later, I had dinner with my mother. She lives 45 minutes away, she and my father both, in the house I grew up in. My father had not come to the will reading. He'd said it didn't feel like his place. My mother had not come either, for a reason she had described as not wanting to make things harder, which I had accepted at the time as a complete sentence and was now beginning to think was not. We sat at the kitchen table with pasta she had made and wine I had brought, and for a while we talked around it, the way you do when you both know the conversation is coming and neither of you is quite ready to start it. She brought it up first. She said she wanted to explain some things about the will, about your grandmother's thinking, and I put my fork down and told her I was listening. What came out over the next hour was this. Approximately 14 months ago, my brother had gone to my grandmother directly. He had told her that he was in a severe financial situation, that he owed money in several directions, that he was at risk of losing the house he and his wife had bought 3 years ago. He had presented this to my grandmother not as a request, but as a reckoning. He needed help, and he needed it soon, and he wanted her to understand the full picture. My grandmother had been distressed. She had called my mother. My mother had called my father, and the four of them, over a series of conversations that had taken place entirely without my knowledge, had arrived at a plan. The plan was the will. The reasoning, as my mother explained it with the careful neutrality of someone who had prepared for this conversation, was that I was stable. I had a good job, a savings account, a life that functioned. My brother did not. The money would do more good where it was going. My grandmother had not wanted to give him a lump sum while she was alive because she worried he would spend it before it could matter. The will was structured to arrive at the right moment. My mother said, "Your grandmother loved you." She said, "She believed you were strong enough to handle it." She said, "I hope you can find a way to understand." I asked my mother one question. I asked whether in any of those conversations anyone had considered telling me what was happening. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that they had discussed it and decided it would create conflict. I drove home. I did not cry, which surprised me a little. I felt something that I can only describe as the sensation of a room becoming a different shape. Not smaller, just different. The furniture rearranged in a way that makes you realize the layout you'd memorized was never quite accurate. I called Bex. I told her the whole thing. She listened to all of it and then she said, "Okay," and then she said, "I need you to talk to someone before you do anything." The someone she meant was a man named Oliver, her husband's college friend who was a trust and estate attorney. I had met him twice at social functions and remembered him as someone who asked good questions and did not fill silences with noise. I called him the next morning and he agreed to meet me for coffee. I brought everything: the will, the letter, the account number on the folded piece of paper, a timeline I had written out the night before because I needed to see it laid flat. Oliver looked at the documents for a long time. He asked me several questions: whether my grandmother had been represented by independent counsel when the will was drafted, or whether she had used a family attorney who also had a relationship with my brother, whether I had any documentation of the conversations that had taken place, text messages, emails, anything, whether I knew the name of my brother's largest creditor. I knew the name of the creditor because my mother had mentioned it once during a conversation she thought I wasn't fully following. A private lending firm, not a bank, the kind with terms that compound in ways a person in crisis doesn't fully calculate at the front end. Oliver finished his coffee and looked at me. He said he wasn't making any promises and that I should understand this might amount to nothing, but he said the circumstances were worth examining. A testator with significant memory concerns in the last 18 months of her life? I haven't mentioned this yet, but he asked. And yes, she had been diagnosed with early cognitive decline 2 years ago. Something else the family had managed quietly, a beneficiary with documented financial pressure, a drafting attorney with an existing relationship to the favored beneficiary, and a provision in the will that described the purpose of the bequest in ways that suggested coaching. He said the phrase restoring the family's footing was not language an 81-year-old woman raised in rural Ohio typically produced on her own. I asked him what came next. He said, "You wait. You collect. You do not tell your brother or your parents that you are doing anything at all. I am not, by nature, a patient person. I say that to be honest, not to sound like someone who heroically overcame it. What I actually did was throw myself into the documentation because having a task made the waiting bearable. I went through every text message I had from my grandmother over the last 2.5 years. I found messages from 18 months ago where she had mentioned my brother coming to visit more frequently, which had not struck me as significant at the time. I found a message from 14 months ago where she said something that had read as a non sequitur then but didn't anymore. She said, "I want you to know that no matter what, I know what you've done for me." I had responded with a heart and moved on with my day. Oliver, meanwhile, had obtained the will drafting history from the county records. The will had been updated 14 months ago. My grandmother's previous will, from 6 years prior, had split the estate evenly between my brother and me. I sat with that fact for a long time. 6 years ago, she had split it evenly. 14 months ago, shortly after my brother's visit and the family meeting I had not been invited to, it had been rewritten entirely in his favor. Oliver found the drafting attorney. He was a man named Mr. Boat Hess, semi-retired, who had done work for my brother's wife's family for over a decade. He was not my grandmother's longtime attorney. She had used a different firm for years. The switch, 14 months ago, had been arranged by my brother. We now had a timeline. What we did not yet have was the moment. Oliver told me to think carefully about what I actually wanted. He said sometimes people want legal remedy and sometimes they want acknowledgement, and those are different roads. He said I should not confuse the satisfaction of confrontation with the resolution of a legal claim. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I thought about my grandmother's handwriting and the photograph of us in the garden and the $14,000 in the account she had opened for me quietly, separately, which felt now less like a gift and more like an apology she hadn't known how to say out loud. I thought about my mother sitting across from me at the kitchen table telling me it would have created conflict, as if conflict were a weather event that had simply needed to be routed around rather than a sign that something had gone wrong. What I wanted was for the truth to exist on record, not revenge exactly, something more like insisting that a thing that happened be acknowledged as a thing that happened. My parents had an anniversary dinner every year in April, a habit they had maintained for over 30 years. They reserved the same private room at the same restaurant. They invited the same 12 people. My brother and his wife always sat at the end nearest the window. I was always seated across from my brother. This year, my mother had called to ask if I was coming, and I had said yes. I called Oliver. I told him the timeline. I asked him whether the documentation was ready to be filed. He said it was, that he had been waiting for my instruction. I told him to file it the week before the dinner. He asked me why the timing mattered. I told him I wanted everyone present when I told my brother that a formal contest of the will had been initiated, that a petition had been filed citing undue influence and questions of testamentary capacity, and that his attorney had already been notified. I wanted to say it at a table where there was no performance available to him, no version of the conversation he could shape before it started, no way to tell the story first. Oliver was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is your choice to make." I went to the dinner. I sat in my usual seat. The room smelled like warm bread and the particular candle my mother has used for 30 years, a vanilla and cedar combination that I have complicated feelings about now. My brother was wearing the navy jacket again. His wife had dressed carefully. They were both relaxed in the way that people are relaxed when they believe the hard part is behind them. We got through the first course. My mother gave a small speech about 33 years, and my father looked at the table and smiled the way he does when he is genuinely moved. My brother raised his glass. I raised mine. Between the first and second course, I looked at my brother and I told him, calmly, that I wanted to mention something before the evening went further. I said that earlier in the week, Oliver Marsh, and I gave his full name, and his firm had filed a formal will contest in the county probate court. I said the filing cited the timeline of the will modification, the involvement of a conflicted drafting attorney, and evidence of testamentary incapacity in the final 18 months of our grandmother's life. I said that his attorney, Mr. Hess, had been served with the initial notice that morning. The room did a thing that rooms do when the air pressure changes. My brother started to say something. His wife put her hand on his arm. My mother looked at my father. My father looked at his water glass. I told my brother that I was not doing this out of anger. I told him that was the most honest thing I could say and I needed him to hear it. I said that what had happened was wrong, not because I was owed a different outcome, but because my grandmother had deserved to make her own choices, and she had been surrounded by people who had decided the choices for her. I said that the woman who had sat with me through 8 hospital visits and called me on random Wednesdays because she could hear something in my voice did not need anyone managing her decisions in her final years. She had deserved better than that, and so had I. My brother said that I was making a scene. I said I understood that was how it looked from where he was sitting. My mother said my name in a particular tone she has used since I was a child, the tone that means, stop this now. And I felt it in my chest the way I always have. I took a breath. I said, I love you, and I mean that. And I'm not stopping. I left after the second course. I hugged my father at the door because he looked hollowed out, and I don't hold things against people who were simply too afraid to be different. I did not hug my mother. I did not look at my brother's wife. Bex was waiting at my apartment. She had brought takeout and had set up my coffee table with the particular efficiency of someone who knew I would not want to make any decisions that night. I sat on the floor and ate noodles, and she did not make me talk until I was ready, which took about 40 minutes. The legal process took 6 months. It was not clean, and it was not cinematic. It was document exchanges and depositions and 3 separate occasions where my brother's attorney sent correspondence that was designed to make me feel like I was being unreasonable. And 3 separate occasions where Oliver responded with something measured and factual that made the correspondence look like what it was. What we ultimately established through the deposition of a neurologist who had treated my grandmother and through records from the assisted living facility was that she had experienced a documented period of increased cognitive vulnerability during the exact window when my brother had visited and the will had been rewritten. The drafting attorney, Mr. Hess, faced a separate inquiry from the state bar regarding undisclosed conflicts of interest. He settled it quietly. The case did not go to trial. My brother and I reached a settlement. The estate was redistributed. I am not going to list the amounts. What I will say is that the outcome was not about the money, and also that the money mattered, and I am not going to pretend otherwise, because that would be a performance of indifference that I don't owe anyone. I changed some things after that. I changed my phone number, not because I never wanted to speak to my family again, but because I needed to decide when those conversations happened, rather than having them happen at me. I sent my mother and father a letter, an actual letter, printed and mailed, that said I needed time and would be in touch when I was ready. I meant it. I am still figuring out what ready looks like. My brother called me 4 times in the month after the settlement. I did not answer. On the 5th call, he left a voicemail that was long and contained several things I think he actually believed and several things I think he hoped I would believe about his intentions. I listened to it once and then I deleted it, not because I was punishing him, because I had already heard what I needed to hear in the way he had not looked at me in Mr. Colebrook's office, in the way he had arrived at that dinner certain the story was already over. In the fall, I did something small and entirely for myself. I took 3 days off work and drove up the coast to a town I had always meant to visit. A place with a harbor and an independent bookstore and a coffee shop that opens at 6:30 in the morning for people who cannot wait. I stayed in a small rental with a window that faced the water. I slept well for the first time in months. I went through my grandmother's cedar box again and looked at the photograph of us in the garden and felt, for the first time, something that was not grief or anger or the complicated residue of all those months of documents and depositions. I felt something quieter than that. I've been thinking, since then, about what it means to be trusted, not in the abstract way, but in the specific way. The way someone decides you are stable enough to absorb a loss, capable enough to handle the short end, resilient enough that the lesser portion won't break you. It is, I have come to understand, a way of loving someone that has its own kind of blindness in it. It can look like faith from the inside and still function as dismissal. My grandmother loved me. I believe that in the particular way I believe things I cannot fully prove but also cannot honestly doubt. The love was real and it was also insufficient, and both of those things can be true, and carrying them both is what this year has mostly been. Bex got a promotion in September, and we went out to celebrate, and I did not talk about any of this for one entire dinner, which felt like a small miracle and also like evidence that I was becoming someone who had a life outside the thing that had happened to her. That is the goal, I think. Not to resolve it neatly, not to arrive at a version of the story where all the pieces make sense. Just to become, gradually, someone for whom this is a part of the story rather than the whole of it. If you have ever watched someone you love look past you to the person they needed you to be, I think you already understand what I am describing. The question I have been sitting with, the one I don't have a clean answer to, but that I keep returning to, is this: at what point did you stop explaining yourself and start simply moving? I am still working on that one. I have thought a lot about what actually set everything in motion. Not the will reading, not the dinner, not the filing. The moment that started all of it was a decision made in a room I was not in, by people who told themselves they were protecting me from conflict while they were building the conditions for the only conflict that has ever genuinely altered my life. That is the part I keep returning to. Not the betrayal itself, but the logic behind it. The reasoning that said, she is strong, she will be fine, she does not need to know. That reasoning sounds like consideration. It functions like erasure. And the thing about being erased quietly, by people who love you, is that it does not announce itself. It accumulates. You go to a will reading thinking you understand the shape of your relationships, and you leave holding a cedar box and a $14,000 account number and a letter full of genuine love that somehow still managed to cut you out entirely. What I understand now, having spent a year sitting with all of it, is that my brother's choices had consequences that were always going to arrive, not because the universe is a ledger or because wrongdoing is punished by some external force, simply because actions exist in time, and time keeps moving, and the things people do quietly do not stay quiet forever. He made a choice to visit an elderly woman with cognitive decline and walk her toward a decision that served him. He made a choice to use a conflicted attorney. He made a choice to sit across from me in that office and not meet my eyes. Each of those choices was a small step in a direction, and the direction had an endpoint. The endpoint was a deposition and a settlement and a bar inquiry and a phone call he made 4 times that I did not answer. I did not do what I did out of anger, and I want to be precise about that because it matters to me. I did it because I had spent 31 years being the person who absorbed things and continued functioning, and at some point the absorption becomes its own kind of complicity. Choosing not to contest the will would not have been grace, it would have been permission. The intelligence part. And I say this not to congratulate myself but because it is genuinely what made the difference, was in waiting. Oliver told me to wait and I waited. Not because I am patient, but because I understood that acting from emotion would give everyone around me the story they needed. The story that I was unstable. That I was difficult. That my grandmother had known what she was doing after all. I did not give them that story. I gave them documents. Bex told me once, during the worst of the paperwork months, that she admired how I was handling it. I told her I wasn't handling it, I was just moving through it the only way I knew how, which was one step at a time with my eyes open. She said that was the same thing. I'm still not sure she's right, but I have started to think it might not matter. What I want to say to anyone who recognizes something in this story is that the version of strength that serves you is not the version that absorbs without limit. It is the version that knows the difference between letting something go because it no longer deserves your energy and letting something go because you are afraid of what holding it will cost. Those are two entirely different choices. One of them is freedom. The other one is just a quieter kind of being diminished. Serena got there eventually. So, I think, can you?